guys. So our first reading today is from Exodus 16:25 and 13:30. Um, the whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread, for you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I am going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them, whether they will follow my instruction or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on the other days." In the evenings, quail came up and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine, flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much of it as each of you needs, an omer to a person according to the number of persons, all providing for those in their own tents." The Israelites did so. Some had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed, and Moses said to them, "Let no one leave any of it over until morning." But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and became foul. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered it, as much as they needed, but when the sun grew hot, it melted. On the sixth day, they gathered twice as much food, 2 omers apiece. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil, and all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning." So they put it aside until morning, as Moses commanded them, and it did not become foul, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none." On the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather, and they found none. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and instructions? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you food for 2 days. Each of you stay where you are. Do not leave your place on the seventh day." So the people rested on the seventh day.
The second reading tonight is from Genesis 2 and Deuteronomy 5. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. Deuteronomy 5, 12 through 15. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male or female slave, or your ox or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the resident alien in your towns, so that the male and female slave may rest as well as you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day.
Everybody, I'm Caitlin. Occasionally I say some stuff up here. Today is one of those days. You can't run. Don't go anywhere. Did anybody drive here? All right, all of you fail. Okay. Anybody make their breakfast today? Awesome. You fail too. Okay. Well, we'll get more into this. So I'm a little bit high strung as a person. All right, I'm being a little conservative here. I'm really high strung as a person. So do any of you experience this too? I believe that there should be a special place for people who go to a busy public place and take up the entire sidewalk and then slow down. Anybody else? Okay, cool. I'm the person behind them going, excuse me, please move. That's me. So picture this, 5 years ago, I'm in Jerusalem with a class, and I'm staying on like the 9th or 10th floor of a hotel, and Saturday morning, I wake up to go to the lobby to get breakfast. I get in the elevator, and somebody has pushed all the lights, all of the buttons in this elevator, and I'm like, what? And so it's going down a floor, opening the doors forever, and then closing them and going down one more floor and opening the doors for an eternity, and then closing them again for like 9 or 10 floors. And I need coffee badly. And this is my hell, is what I'm trying to say. Actually, it's a Shabbat elevator. Come to find out, observant Jews are not allowed to do any kind of work on the Sabbath, and for them that includes starting a fire, or the electronic modern day equivalent, completing a circuit. Which is to say, no pushing buttons, no turning things off and on. Picture you're an observant Jewish person, you leave your lamp on, go to your Shabbat service, come back and realize, great, I have to sleep in my bedroom with the lights on all night. That is the intensity of some of the restrictions on Shabbat. And so anyway, I'm finding out about this at breakfast. They're explaining the Shabbat elevator, and I'm like, you know what? That's actually really impressive that this modern day nation has figured out a way to adapt an ancient practice. That's genius. And then I realized that I've left something in my room. So I took the stairs. So this week we're going to be continuing our series on rest. We're going to take a deep dive into Sabbath or Shabbat, the Jewish day of rest. And you may ask, how is this ancient Jewish practice relevant? Well, for one thing, here at Collective, we try to hear from the wisdom of traditions from all around the world, from all kinds of people and belief systems. I don't know about you, but I loved the interfaith panel that we had a couple weeks ago. I think it's a beautiful thing to hear from an imam and a Baha'i and a Hindu and a Buddhist, and for them to each have their own experience and teachings and specific advice, and yet to connect with the same deep human truths. That sometimes we take work a little bit too far and we become unhealthy, that our culture is built on a never-ending greed for more and more, that we need practices that liberate us from spending our lives as cogs in a machine and never really living. So adding the Jewish experience to this is critical, as this tradition has so much wisdom to give the world. And when it comes to ceasing work and prioritizing rest, the Jewish people are undoubtedly experts. And if for you, the message of Jesus is compelling, if it's life-orienting or life-changing, then you will be missing out on so much of his life and the context of his words if we forget that Jesus was Jewish. And you may have been exposed to understandings of Christianity that say that Jesus came to replace Judaism. But just because Jesus was a Jewish reformer who pushed back on the legalism and literalism of some of his community and some of its more power-hungry leadership, that doesn't mean that the Sabbath wasn't at the core of his own spiritual practices. He would have taken Sabbath every week of his life, and as we'll discuss, that would have been a central characteristic of his Jewish theology. So what does it mean to practice Sabbath? You may think of Sabbath as a set of restrictions from doing work, and you'd be right. The Jewish tradition entails 39 restrictions observed from just before sunset on Friday to, and this is interesting, the time when 3 stars appear in the night sky on Saturday. So like somebody's counting, and that makes me happy. Everything, in these 39 restrictions, from preparing wool or leather, baking, building, handling money, plowing the earth, and in turn, its modern day equivalents like driving a car or using electronics. But it isn't just the act of refraining from doing work. It's a time of spiritual depth and practice. It's a time for relationships that get neglected in the pursuit of achievement. It's a time to catch up with your children, to spend time with your partner. It's a time of conversation and friendship. You might be picturing the Jewish Shabbat as a quiet time spent in solitude, catching up on like a spiritual book or reading the Bible or journaling. But there are actually restrictions on reading and writing, I think, because they somehow know that people will find a way to get work accomplished. That would be me. I would be guilty of that. A more accurate picture of Jewish Shabbat would look more like people debating the meaning of a parable or arguing about current events over a glass of wine. Abraham Joshua Heschel, has anybody heard of him? Yes, Sharon. He's one of the most respected Jewish scholars in the 20th century. He escaped Poland during the Holocaust. He was on the front lines of the American Civil Rights Movement. His book, The Sabbath, explains the way that the practice of weekly rest forms the theological backbone of the Jewish faith. And one piece of advice, like, don't listen to anything else I say, just read the book. He's making my life really easy. I'm just going to let him preach the sermon tonight. But he teaches that following the legalistic rules around Sabbath is just the beginning. It's one thing just to not break the restrictions, but the intention is for you to change your philosophy, for this to shape your brain chemistry, for this to get into your psyche, and to change your core beliefs about who you are and what you are on this planet to do. For instance, he says, 6 days a week we wrestle with the world, wringing profit from the earth. On the Sabbath, we especially care for the seed of eternity planted in the soul. The world has our hands, but our soul belongs to someone else. 6 days a week we seek to dominate the world. On the seventh day, we try to dominate the self. I don't have anything like that for you. So how have you cared for the seed of eternity placed in your soul recently? And let's say that you don't buy into the idea of a soul. Feel free to reframe the question. How are you caring for your emotional and mental well-being? How are you nurturing yourself? And in what ways are you trying to dominate the self? You might call this ego. You might have heard it referred to as the false self, or some particularly unhealthy tendency maybe you have and you're working on. There's a danger that we might practice rest, but then treat it as a means to more productivity. Is anybody practicing that on accident? Or on purpose? So I've been taking Sabbath practice a little bit more seriously myself recently. For one thing, I knew this series was coming up, and I've heard that the greatest threat to Christianity today isn't heresy, it's hypocrisy. So I decided I would shape up because some of you would call me out. Dan, somehow I know it's you. But more importantly, I was hit with a perfect storm of exhaustion recently. I was already going along in a hectic season. We were trying to finish up the semester's activities at Stetson. And then I closed on my house on a Tuesday. I moved on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. I had a day-long event on Saturday, and then I got a call to go home because my grandmother was dying. And the following 9 days were the most exhausting of my life. I flew all night. I sat up in the hospital for 2 days. I helped make arrangements. I wrote an obituary. I organized a funeral. I gave a eulogy. Also, grief is a physically exhausting thing. And I have never been more tired in my life. So I had to do something different. So I've been practicing a true Sabbath every week for 2 months now. And I'm still driving my car and everything, like, don't get me wrong. But I'm learning to totally abstain from work. No matter what project has to wait or what email hasn't been answered, I've been making some tougher rules for myself to stay healthier and to maintain the practice. And I've discovered a few things. One is that it works. Another is that I've had a number of bad habits about Sabbath, or what I've called like my day off. I'm personally guilty of thinking of rest or Sabbath as a tool to recover mentally and physically so that I can be even more productive when I work, as if rest is for the purpose of work. It's true in my experience that when I'm overworked and sleepy and grumpy, I'm way less productive or fun to be around for 70 hours than I would have been if I were healthy and well rested for 40. But if this is what we believe about the meaning of rest, we're going to fall into the same trap of believing that our value still comes from our productivity and that our worthiness as people still comes from our work. To the Jewish mind, you would have followed the law, but you would have missed the lesson. I found that if I plan just a few emails, like I'm taking the day off, but I'm just going to shoot a couple emails, just 15, 20 minutes, like max. Or I'm just going to make a call because, it's Friday, it's business hours, whatever. Even if I've got hours before I'm going to do that, even if it's just going to be for 20 minutes, I've learned that I can't get in the headspace of rest because I'm still in work mode. Just some tips of the trade, things I'm learning. Rabbi Heschel says about this that on the Sabbath, even thinking of business or labor should be avoided. Labor is a craft, but perfect rest is an art. Perfect rest is an art. It is the result of an accord between body, mind, and imagination. To attain a degree of excellence in art, one must accept its discipline. This is one of my favorite metaphors for religious traditions and laws and restrictions, that it's like becoming a jazz musician. You've heard me say it before, possibly. You have to understand musical theory before you can play with other people and before you can improvise. So earlier I called Sabbath the theological backbone of the Jewish faith. So what does Sabbath do? Rest is great and all, and perhaps a little bit harder to define than we thought. But Sabbath isn't just a list of rules or a practice. It's not a weekly ritual. Sabbath is a lifestyle at its best. For the most observant Jewish families, preparation for the Sabbath shapes their everyday life all 7 days of the week. It isn't just about being off work for 24 hours. You have to make sure that your house and your business and your food are all prepared for the Sabbath, or it's going to be a real rough Saturday. The traditional Shabbat dinner blessing begins with an offering of peace and then is followed by praise of the matriarch of the family in recognition that she has likely been grocery shopping and cooking all day and cleaning all day to make sure that the Sabbath goes smoothly, that everything that the family's going to eat has already been pre-made. Sabbath affects where they can live. You have to be within a certain walking distance of your synagogue because you can't drive to the services. Everybody's living in a neighborhood near each other. It affects how their business can operate and what hours it can keep. If you're restricted from completing transactions on the Sabbath, what do you do if you own a company that operates business online? So many Orthodox-owned online businesses will allow you to add stuff to your cart, but not to check out until Shabbat is over. There's like a ticking a clock, which I think is really interesting. I ran into that trying to buy a couch the other day. It might affect what appliances you can buy. For instance, if one of the restrictions on Sabbath is completing a circuit, which is to say turning on or off an electronic, then Jewish families have to remember to tape the switch that otherwise turns their refrigerator light on when they open the door. Otherwise, they can't use their refrigerators at all on Shabbat. Did you know that you can buy ovens that have a Shabbat setting that can be left on warm for days at a time without burning your house down? because the oven you probably have at home after like 6 or 12 hours will auto shut off. But Jewish holidays can go for several days at a time where they have to follow Shabbat restrictions. And if you don't have that, then you can't just like leave it on warm and slide a casserole in and pull it back out later. And it's going to seriously wreck your house and your utility bill. So what would it mean for us if we oriented every day around our need for rest and balance? What if we actually let it change our life every day, not just on our day off or on our vacation, right? What if we let that drive get into our daily routine and into the consumer choices we make and into the jobs that we take? One practice that I've found really helpful when I plan my day and journal in the morning, I have a practice where I write down 3 things I'm grateful for and 3 things I'm excited about. And every day I make sure that one of the things I'm excited about is something for my day off. So over the course of the week, I build up like a really cool plan for what I'm going to do. It's usually like Disney. And I'm dealing with the intense criticism of my colleagues who don't find that restful at all. But I'm building up a contract over the course of a week with myself for what I'm going to do with my day off. And if I do that, I found that I'm far more likely to follow through and actually take the day off, right? So if the saying goes, those who fail to plan to fail, those who do not plan to rest often fail to rest, right? So Sabbath is a lifestyle, but how does Sabbath shape the theology of Judaism? You might think that sounds strange. Isn't Sabbath something that's practiced simply because if you don't, you're breaking the rules? Not exactly. The Sabbath is the Hebrew Bible, or you might have just heard it called the Old Testament's constant refrain. It's not an afterthought. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, Sabbath is built into the very creation of the universe, as we read in Genesis 2. I know it's going to sound really repetitive, but the heavens and the earth were finished in all their multitude. And on the 7th day, God finished the work that he had done. And he rested on the 7th day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the 7th day and hallowed it because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. Right? And I know that it sounds repetitive. We got it. God finished the work of creation on the 7th day. Sounds like God's tying up loose ends. So if that were me, that'd be like the last emails or calls, right? That I didn't get done on the 6th day. Yet it doesn't say that anything was made. It makes it clear that an effort was made. The only creation on the 7th day is the Sabbath. Rest was the final effort, which is to say, the work isn't finished until God rests. Which is to say, creation isn't perfect until there's rest. According to Walter Brueggemann, who's one of the most respected Old Testament scholars alive today, this passage tells us 3 simple things. 1 is that Yahweh is not a workaholic. 2 is that Yahweh is not anxious about the full functioning of creation. And 3, that the well-being of creation does not depend on endless work. Which I read as if the creator or the very life force of the universe or the source of all being, whatever you want to call it, rests, then who the hell are you not to? And then I say that to myself in the mirror every morning. And push back still. To the Jewish mind, Sabbath is God's answer to the human condition and the reorientation of how we conceive of the divine. Last week, we explored the notion that rest is built into the very nature of the universe, that it's evident in the rhythms of animal life and tides and circadian rhythms. Yet our primal human inclination is the drive to collect stuff, to gain things and to store them up, to dominate land, to gain wealth and worldly power, to get bigger, better, and more stuff. We want to take up more and more space, right? And when our human love of stuff seeps into our spirituality, we start to believe that the divine works the same way, that God is present only in particular places, like on a special mountain or in a particular temple or a statue or a nation, And that's the slippery slope of idolatry in the Jewish story. We create God in our own image by putting God in a container of beliefs or limitations or even a physical object, and then saying, God, if you don't fit in this box I made, then you're not God, right? Heschel argues that Sabbath shifts us from a spirituality concerned with space to one oriented around time. This creator who rests is instead concerned with history and events and experiences. When our spirituality is oriented around time, it opens up a whole new way of being human. And he writes, to gain control of the world of space is certainly one of our tasks. The danger begins when in gaining power in the realm of space, we forfeit all aspirations in the realm of time. There is a realm of time where the goal is not to have, but to be, not to own, but to give, not to control, but to share, not to subdue, but to be in accord. Life goes wrong when the control of space, the acquisition of things, of space, becomes our sole concern. Take a second with that one. And then he says, we cannot conquer time through space. We can only master time in time. The higher goal of spiritual living is not to amass a wealth of information, but to face sacred moments. What we plead against is man's unconditional surrender to space, his enslavement to things. We must not forget that it is not a thing that lends significance to a moment. It is the moment that lends significance to things. It is the moment that lends significance to things. This God throughout history hears the cry of the oppressed. This God breaks out of prescribed holy places and shows up in the wilderness. This God, unlike the tribal gods of warring nation states amassing wealth to build the biggest temple or tower, manifests in the events of history rather than in things or places. This God is more concerned with showing up in people's lives and experiences. This is a God of mystery and movements, of the unimaginable and the unattainable. One thing, when you hear idolatry, try not to think of it in overly simplistic terms. This isn't just about primitive people who worship like a golden calf or a stone statue because they actually believe it has the power to bless. Idolatry is about the worship of material things. It's about belief in a God who demands more and more. The idolatrous religion that is being critiqued in the Hebrew Bible is about the gods of transaction. The idea that God is waiting on you to make a sufficient sacrifice in order to bless you with fertility or abundance. I have a sense that our world is still filled with gods of transaction. And as always, these are gods that we have made in our own image. And this is why Sabbath is always, always, always tied to liberation. In the text you heard in Deuteronomy, which is just another account of the Ten Commandments, Sabbath is not just for the Jewish people. It's a gift intended for their workers and servants. It provides a baseline of the ethical treatment of people. It's a warning for the Israelites not to become a new Pharaoh to somebody else. Sabbath even provides an environmental ethic. You can't overwork your animals. You don't just get to keep demanding more of the land. Everything and everyone deserves rest, a pause from unending toil. When the Israelites leave Egypt, Sabbath is the first lesson. In Egypt, they couldn't practice their faith. Their life as slaves was dependent on the constant production of bricks to build storehouses for more and more grain that nobody was eating as Egypt expanded its empire. The Israelites couldn't take Sabbath because Egypt's greed for more and more power and wealth came first. And in their despair, the Israelites cry out, and this God hears the cry of the oppressed. And this God leads them out of Egypt and into the wilderness. And you may not have to buy into the story, but see if there's a symbol in the message, right? And then this God grants them food to live on, manna from heaven, and provides for the Sabbath. But this God knows the human condition. They just left Egypt, so what do? They try to store up manna and forsake the Sabbath. They immediately begin the same pattern of constant toil and greed, but without anybody making them do it. I think this is a subtle observation, letting us know that whether it's after the exodus from Egypt or after the fall of Rome, our habit is to create the same empire we just escaped. Because we are prisoners to a pattern, as if all things are going to be different. It's going to be different this time when we're on top, right? And because we have a holiday coming up this week, it bears mentioning that this pattern isn't just an ancient trait. It's something like if brave people sailed halfway around the world to experience a just society and freedom of religion, and yet built a nation on the backs of slave labor on indigenous people's land, or a nation with a relentless 24/7 economy that's never satisfied, or a military industrial complex that Rome could only dream of. It's like if a nation of immigrants were to create legislative and physical barriers to people who likewise come to its shores. Sabbath is always tied to liberation because the God who hears the cry of the oppressed is aware of our insatiable appetite. This God's first lesson to the Israelite community is how to practice Sabbath again. It's a lesson in distinguishing between the need to have enough and the need to store up just a little bit more. It's crucial that they relearn it so that they don't become a new kind of Egypt. Because as we see throughout the Hebrew Bible, this God hears the cry of the oppressed no matter who is doing the oppressing. This God pays attention when refugees are turned away from finding a safe harbor, no matter what national identity or religious creed they hold. And this God is concerned when children journey through a literal wilderness, seeking a new home, and then end up in cages. This God hears the cry of the oppressed, and this God knows the cry of 10,000 children separated from their families here. This lesson is vital because Sabbath is an opportunity to stop, to pause, to refrain, just to hesitate regularly in the face of this unending, relentless desire for more. It's a weekly reset, a constant reminder that our value as humans is not derived from our ability to produce, that our neighbor's value is not dependent on what they can do for us. Or put more simply, it's a time to recognize that you're a human being, not a human doing. And there's one last thing. There's a very important aspect of Sabbath that's been lost in Christianity's effort to do away with legalism. For instance, there's a text in the second chapter of Mark when Jesus is challenged by the Pharisees because he and his disciples don't honor all the strict restrictions of the Sabbath in exactly the same way, right? He says, Sabbath was made for mankind, humankind, for the Sabbath. And this is often taken to mean that Sabbath isn't a priority or that Sabbath can be abandoned following Jesus' life, or as a critique of the restrictive nature of Jewish practice. And we're going to hear more about this next week. Katie and Ben are going to bring it. But this same teaching was actually held by many ancient rabbis. And Rabbi Heschel agrees with the sentiment. Legalism can be taken too far. But without some of the ancient Jewish framework, the Christian tradition lost elements of what Sabbath is or lost the practice entirely. Most importantly, without the commitment of the entire community to a specific time and particular way of practicing, we lose the communal nature of Sabbath. This practice brought the community together every week in their neighborhoods and homes, around tables and food, for conversation and debate. Even if those of us who are taking a Sabbath regularly are finding rules and practices that serve us, we're still largely doing this alone. Maybe with a friend or a partner or close family, we've lost Sabbath's ability to hold us together. At Occupy Trilogy, we even wondered if some of the reason that there are hundreds of sects of Christianity and only a few divisions in Judaism is that Sabbath held their community together physically in the face of disagreement. Sabbath can hold a place for our doubt and disbelief. I've been told by an Orthodox rabbi that the idea of right practice, orthopraxy, has to be kept in order for the debate of ideas, like the pursuit of orthodoxy, to be possible. For instance, two rabbis can believe differently about a passage or teaching, but if one doesn't keep kosher, the other one can't come to his house to debate it with him, right? And they can't chat over lunch. Practice holds space necessary for difference. I have a good story from a friend of mine who, as she grew up, she's Jewish, from a Jewish family, and she started to doubt some of the faiths. She studied religion. She was like, I don't know about this. And she called her dad, and she said, hey, Dad, I don't know if I believe this stuff anymore. I don't know if I buy into the stories in the same way. And he said, oh, that's okay. Like, you don't have to do that. But find a synagogue in your neighborhood and just freaking go. And he didn't say freaking, just to be clear. Just freaking go. Just go. Because it wasn't about believing the right things. It was about maintaining her identity, staying a part of the community, practicing it. And faith might follow, right? But if you don't practice it, if you don't stay connected, then you might lose that core piece of yourself. Another one of my friends experienced this as a child growing up in a cultural but not particularly devout Jewish family. The rabbinical tradition is it teaches by asking questions. So she was always welcome to debate anything. No rabbi ever put her down for not believing something she was supposed to. If she didn't believe some teaching or didn't believe in God, it didn't matter. Her identity as a part of the community wasn't based on her having the right beliefs. She already belonged. She belonged from the moment of her birth. There's nothing she can do or believe to be more or less Jewish. When we look at legalism and judge it as simple or tribal or petty, we often lose the important lesson. Unconditional belonging and community always come first. For Jesus, unconditional belonging came before right practice and right belief. Unconditional grace precedes you following all the right rules and ascribing to all the so-called right beliefs. I think grace is the great holdout from the Jewish community's sense of unconditional belonging. It's the assurance that there's nothing you can do to be more loved, and there is nothing that you can do to be less loved. It's the invitation to come to the table, whoever you are, just as you are, with doubts and questions and imperfect practices, rested and weary, to know that you belong first, that you are loved first. And all that's left is for you to accept the invitation and just freaking go. To remember that this bread and this cup, blessed in a Jewish ritual of community, was first offered to imperfect people who did not believe the same things and did not agree on the same practices and even betrayed one another. Therefore, this table is set for us, and it is set for all people, and no one will ever be turned away.